to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, and I'm here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation. We're here to discuss articles and book reviews in our journal, The Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, for which Jim Peterson is the editor. And we're glad to have all of you with us. Today is a member request day, and at the request of Janelle Curry, we are so glad to have one of the key articles in the June 2022 issue of our journal. It's titled Reflective Practice and Faith Integration is the topic. And we're so glad to have the two co-authors with us today, Camden Baucke and Lauren Seifert. Welcome, Lauren. Want to say hello?
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, welcome, Camden.
Welcome. Thank you. Welcome. What am I talking about?
Yeah.
Thank you guys for having me.
Okay, that's great. All right. So what we usually do in our program, there are, I would say, a good number of people in the audience here who haven't met you before and aren't familiar with you. So we'd like to just give you a little brief introduction of sorts. So Lauren, let's start with you for a little bit. Where are you from? You're in Ohio right now, I understand, but where were you born and raised?
Yeah, born and raised 10 minutes away from Malone University.
My.
Malone University alum. And we have Cleveland Bible College, which became Malone College, which then became Malone University. We have it in our blood. My dad knew the Reverend John Grafton Sr. from the age of 10. So, yeah. So
my goodness.
I'm born and raised, and I actually spent 2 years of my life in San Francisco, which is kind of fun. But
that's like a foreign country from what is it, Camden, Ohio, or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Camden, how about you? Are you from Ohio also? You're in Michigan now.
Mm-hmm. I am from a little suburb near northern Cincinnati called Loveland, Ohio.
Aha.
And
there's the Ohio connection. Yeah.
Oh, yes. So born and raised there, and then I met Dr. Seifert when I went to Malone University.
Ah, so you're an alum over there, huh? Okay,
yes,
but
yes, I am.
Why'd you pick Malone?
I picked Malone because it had a faith connection. Both my parents, the household was Christian. You know, we raised us with kind of on those tenets. And at the time, I had a football scholarship there, so I got to go there as well. So got to go to the environment that they wanted me to go to, and I got to save some money doing it. So
that's great. So Lauren, you clearly have a family connection there it was deep and connected there. But how did you get drawn to psychology?
Yes, through the wonderful grace of God, I'll tell you. I was going to be a biologist, and I started taking psychology courses at the University of Akron as an undergraduate there, and fell in love with developmental psychology first, and then cognitive experimental psychology second, through courses that I took with the late Ray Sanders and Marty Murphy and Dick Howdy and Harvey Stearns. And then there was just no going back. God was calling me to that. And you know, when you feel a call to be prayerful about it, it is very important. And so I ended up fusing psychology and biology. I have a doctorate in cognitive experimental psychology, which has...
From where?
That's from Ohio State, yeah.
That is Ohio State. Okay, I see.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for asking that. I didn't mention.
Yeah.
And then I have a doctoral minor in psychobiology. Also, if I didn't mention it, have psycholinguistics as an emphasis area, and studied aging and sociology from the very beginning of my study. So have a lot of breadth there, but have a research focus in methods. So I'm by training a methodologist, which makes it so that I have a lot of latitude. I can work across many areas in psychology and work in qualitative and quantitative methods and mixed methods as well.
That's great. Now, did you go to Malone directly after graduate school, or did you work elsewhere?
I did. I had taught while I was in grad school at Ohio State. I taught for a semester at Capital University, which is a Lutheran institution that's not far away from Ohio State,
Mm-hmm.
and then went to Malone, but took a brief foray. 2 years I was in a research and teaching position at the University of Akron, and then came back to Malone. They called me and said, "Would you come back?" I was like, "Yeah." So.
Okay. Right. That's good. So, Camden, you told us how you came to Malone. How did you come to pick psychology?
So for me, it's hard not to mention just my personal life experience in my choice for psychology. I grew up with global aphasia, and so it was something where there weren't a lot of treatments for it at the time, or at least in the area. But my parents were spectacular, and my mother was a nurse, and she did a lot of things to help me along the way, and met a lot of really, really wonderful people and interventions and everything like that. And, I'm here today because of God, because of them. But I went to Malone thinking I wanted to pursue nursing, be like my mom who did so much for me. And then I found myself looking at the lab sheets more than actually answering the call lights. So that turned out to be a big problem. So then I eventually just said, I want to pick a career where I want to explore more, where my curiosity is a little bit more satisfied. And I switched from nursing over to psychology, which was already my minor. And there I met Dr. Seifert. And yes, so.
The rest is history. So you went on and did some graduate work in psychology as well?
Correct. So while I was with Dr. Seifert, I studied chronic illness, things such as migraines. And then I went on to graduate school at Eastern Michigan University. There I was in the pediatric lab, where it was just an NIH-funded project to look at infant development and a lot of environmental factors. So that was very, very rewarding. And now I work in private practice. Okay.
Moving from Ohio to Michigan, that's enemy territory, isn't it? I mean, that's tough. Right.
For my interview, I showed up and I showed them my ID for the hotel. And they're like, "Are you an Ohio State fan?" So
that's right. Beware a little bit. Okay, so final question over here. How did the two of you come to focus on this particular article? What made you collaborate on this? What made you write this? How did you come to do this article? Either one of you, who wants to start?
So I could probably start. I knew at the end of my undergraduate career that I want to be going to grad school, so I would need some research experience. And so I met with Dr. Seifert, and we figured out a way to do an independent research study or just independent case study. And so then we ended up doing a case study for the course of that semester, and then, working on reflective practice the entire way. And then we kind of, let it sit and kind of exchange thoughts about it for a good amount of time. And we kind of recognized the significance of what we did and how we did it. And so we thought that would be something worth writing about.
Yeah. I would add, if I may, that I think part of that was actually in the reflective practice that we did, that as we reflected, we began to see the significance of not writing an article about how do we evangelize clients. That's not what it's about. Or how do we explore faith with our clients? And that's not what the article's about. But how do we imbue the work that we do in every moment, whether we're currently with the client or apart from the client, with the reflection, the special kind of reflection that only comes from taking everything to God and reflecting with him for guidance. And I would say this about it in particular. I think Camden's very, very good at this. He, even as a student, recognized that everybody is coming to what they do from a place, to go back into some of the things that we cited in our article. And if we don't acknowledge that, if we don't acknowledge what are our core beliefs, where are we coming to this practice from, then we're denying the very essence of our being. And so I think that was something that I saw in him as a student that he has carried through into his graduate work and his practice. And I think that's part of why it ended up as an article.
That's great. And if I may, what was your connection with the ASA? Why did you pick this particular journal to publish your work?
Yeah, I suggested it. I was a member. I have to admit, I'm not currently a member.
Oh no, we'll have to take care of that.
We'll have to fix that. I was a member for quite a while, many years ago, and I published in the journal and have been very impressed with the high quality of the scholarship that is in the journal. And so that is essentially why I suggested.
Okay. Well, this is our effort to recover the lost sheep. Camden, how about you? Did you have a connection with ASA?
I think not necessarily a prior connection like Dr. Seifert, but for me, when I saw, just quite literally even the name of Perspectives on Science of the Christian Faith, I was like, oh, hey, these two worlds can be married together. I'm like, this is really refreshing.
Yeah, very good. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much. I think that gives all of us a better appreciation for where you're coming from and your background here. So, Vicki, I'd like you to open up the microphone so that people can unmute. Just to remind everyone, please keep your microphones muted unless I call on you to speak, and we'll order that. At first, we will have the people who submitted questions in advance. And after that, if you click on the reactions icon at the bottom and select raise hand, then I will see your raise hand and call on you in order. Do not try the chat thing. I'm not going to monitor chat here. So if you want to raise your hand and speak, you need to use that reaction board a little bit. So the first person to submit a question was Ken Turian. And I see Ken over there. Welcome to the program again, Ken. And if you could ask your question, please.
I've forgotten the details of the question. But basically, what I was asking is this reflective practice is very important, of course, for clinical psychologists. It became very obvious that this is a technique that I, as an applied physicist, can use in my defense of the apologetics. We have now moved to a retirement center called Covenant Living. It is under the umbrella of the Covenant Church, but we have a number of Unitarian Universalists who are deathly afraid of Christianity, the evangelical Christians. So I realized that instead of dumping things on them, sit back and ask questions and let them open up and find out where they're coming from. And I find that very useful. And I was wondering if any of the ASA members use this approach from the scientific apologetics perspective. So that was my question. It's kind of obvious, but still, it's something we tend to jump in instead of sitting back and listening and letting them open up, put them at ease before one of the guys I have here is his son on his chest is atheist. And he says, I'm a committed atheist. So that only opens up things that I ask him to go deeper into it.
Okay. So, Lauren?
Yeah, I'd love to reflect on that and talk a bit more about it, Ken. I think that I'm thinking back in my own field, there's a paper, it's got to be 2005 maybe, that comes out of the positive psychology tradition. Marty Seligman and his colleagues, the paper is by Dalsgaard, Peterson, and Seligman about common virtues. And they looked across numerous faith traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and the philosophical traditions in ancient Greece. And their goal was to try to find common virtues and values. And I have my students read this paper because I think it helps them to understand that at our very essence, humans have things in common. And if we start with our humanity, if we start there and we engage each other in active and reflective listening, it does exactly what you say. It brings us to a place where we can better understand each other. And if we think about it in terms of reflective practice, it might allow us a kind of collaborative reflective practice that we would not necessarily otherwise have had. If we open up with just, here's where I am, and I'm telling you, other people have a tendency to close down, especially if they're already afraid of what our perspectives might be. If we listen first and listen for what we might have in common, then we begin to find those pieces where we can better communicate across the common ground. And if we look in the sciences, Kahneman and Tversky, for example, Latham Perez, individuals who had in their own disciplines very different perspectives, who purposefully came together in order to communicate, hear each other about those differences, and try to resolve them toward progress in science. I think we can see some excellent examples. Now, those are secular examples, but I think for us, coming to it from a place of our Christian faith, where we are always necessarily informed by it, allows us to see, okay, so if someone else is Buddhist, if someone else is Jewish, if someone else is Muslim, what I must first do is seek to understand before then I can communicate about who I am and what I believe. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that question and comment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Camden, any comment?
Mine will not be as eloquent as Dr. Seifert's, but I agree in the sense that one of the fundamental values of that we find in our practice and reflective practice is non-exclusivity, and not saying that this behavior is reserved for this person, this behavior is reserved for this group of people. We are essentially trying to say that, as she said earlier, we all come from some place, and even referring back to biblical examples, Jesus being in a place of people who were not called Christians at the time, and just existing in a sense of he understood the values, and that's how he interacted and did what he did. So
okay,
that's my tidbit.
That's great. Yeah, and I think later in the open discussion, I think if other ASA members would like to show how they've carried out some of what Ken asked about, that would be great. So thank you, Ken. Let's move on to Kathy Arvidsson. Good to have you with us, Kathy. And why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I really did enjoy reading the article about how the reflective practice, that we can just bring our total self and faith with us wherever we go, and just as long as we're open to how the Spirit would have us interact with the particular client or person, or as Ken mentioned, it doesn't have to be in a clinical setting. It can be where we live and work, and just know that Christ goes with us wherever we go, and Christ will give us that wisdom. I want to take a slightly different tack, just in terms of, Lauren, your experience in the field of psychology over the years. My field, I'm a professional counselor and have taught in a Christian counseling program, recently retired, but for 23 years. And I've just noticed, you mentioned in your article, you kind of pointed out the animosity there's often been between the secular psychology and counseling and Christians. And I've noticed that too. I've been in the field a little bit longer than you, unfortunately, maybe about 40 years. And I've noticed over the past 20 years, I would say a thawing, and I just would like to get your perspective. There's been a more of an openness, I believe, maybe it's because of positive psychology contributions, because it seems to draw a lot upon Christian values, as well as I think the accreditation of so many professional psychology and counseling programs from Christian universities, and graduates like Camden and yourself who have been publishing and speaking at conferences and really contributing to the field. And there's just been a great deal of respect and collegiality, I believe, and interaction that I hadn't seen previous to maybe 20 years ago. And in my field, in counseling, in 2009, there was the acceptance by American Counseling Association of the the spiritual competencies guidelines, where universities and counseling programs and not only encouraged but required students to become very aware and informed about the major religious backgrounds and how to be sensitive and open to that in their counseling. So just wondered if you're noticing that there's been more dialogue and acceptance between the secular and the professional secular, I'd say, psychology field.
Thank you, Kathy. I tremendously appreciate that you brought these points up, because one, I would say in our article, we talk about the animosity in order to contextualize it. I think for those of us, whether in research as I am or practice as you have been and continue to be, for us, regardless of whether it's research or practice, I think we've seen in psychology and counseling that there is this thawing, but that the backdrop for that is a century.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Tremendous animosity, so much so. I mean, I'm thinking back to an experience I had teaching at a secular institution where someone in the counseling department said, I raised the issue of faith and spirituality as it related to clients. And one of the faculty members said, oh, we don't consider that. That's a lot of baloney. Now, this was, it's been a couple decades ago, but I, as a person of faith, I was so very alarmed to think that the students in that program were being trained to disregard religion and faith and spirituality as important parts of the whole person in therapy. That I was not quiet about it, which probably was, not good for me within that department. But hey, sometimes you have to just say, I think this is not a good way to go. Now, fortunately, and as you point out, we are we have been in an era of thawing, and I think we're seeing tremendous progress. I will say this, that as counseling and psychology, as the behavioral sciences, have become much more international and there's much more of a global dialogue, we have some tremendous challenges. So we have China with a nationwide initiative to be at the top in terms of science and scientific discovery. And so they're publishing a lot. We have some other nations as well that are doing that. And we, because of the rapid growth of the internet since about 2005, see that the average person is on the internet every day. And so if we add those things to the mix in terms of the consideration, I think we're at a time of tremendous change where our voices, the voices of people of faith who believe that exploring the whole person and exploring the individual's personal values, beliefs, and spirituality, religion, and faith is critically important to the therapeutic process and critically important to science. We have to make our voices a bit louder, and I think the thawing will continue. In my work as an associate editor at Current Psychology, we see papers come in from all around the globe, and we have folks who really eschew any notion of faith or religion or spirituality. But as you say, as you duly note, positive psychology, because it has been so popular, has been helping, I believe, as you do, to make inroads where inroads were not made before, where, okay, so let's consider the whole person. Let's consider, what is this client's value system? What is the practitioner's value system? How do those interact? And then as we are in the therapeutic process, not necessarily to be revealing our own faith, because there are some, there's some issues there with disclosing and ethical, the boundaries related to practice, but allowing the client to fully explore and consider who he or she is during the therapeutic process, which has to include faith.
Okay.
Thank you.
Camden, you want to comment?
Yes, and thank you again for this great question. For me, when I have worked with clients regarding spirituality, it can have a huge impact on their mental health. And, in the research showing, one of the big studies that I found interesting was, I think in Dr. Seifert's class, was positive versus negative religious coping. And I was like, okay, so our relationship, even with Christ, with God, can be different in different contexts based on relationships with other people. And so that's when I started to see, okay, yes, the material of speaking about faith with clients is incredibly important if it's their faith. But, in the article, more so talking about not so much the material of the conversations, but the method of the conversations, of how if we live to our values or not as we are working with somebody, and how we consider their values at the exact same time. So that's my little tidbit. So thank you.
Okay. All right. Anything else, Kathy? Does that take care of it?
No, thank you very much for your thoughtful answers.
Okay. That's great. Thank you, Kathy. And so the next was Janelle Curry. Janelle, you recommended the topic here. Thank you. And you submitted not just one, but 5 questions. And we'll
let me ask one.
Well, you can ask more than one. By all means, you ask all 5 of them. They're good, but we'll interleave them a little bit with some other, just to give everybody a chance to talk. But go ahead.
Well, I really appreciated this article and how it essentially drew on the practice of spiritual reflection. But from my understanding, the practice of reflection in clinical psychology is one that is used pretty extensively. What makes what you're proposing different than what is being generally practiced, even in secular settings, in order to enhance, the outcome or be more effective?
I can speak to that. And thank you again so much for this question. It really had me thinking about it and thinking about that process. And I think what I can best frame it as is just using our value system to live out our faiths and our values in our lives while using specific articles or specific verses from Scripture to support that. And so, giving an example, Dr. Seifert and I, when we would have our reflective practice, one of the key verses I drew upon was John 15:13, where, sacrifice and sacrificing your perspective. And that was a specific verse within the specific doctrine that I follow that allows me not only to fully live out my life as a Christian, but to also have it transform my practice, transform the way I think about how I interact with other people, and how I can give up some of the authority that I think I got through grad school and things like that. Does that make sense in a way?
Yeah, I just wondered could a non-Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim use a similar practice using their own sacred texts in order to enhance their approach? Do you think it would be effective?
That's an interesting question, right? And I would add to what Camden said to the first question, responded to in the first question with this, that prayerfulness, using Schoen's basic approach of reflective practice, which is it is very common in counseling and psychology, but adding prayerfulness and reading of Scripture with it. So if we have that going for us in Christian faith, in reflective practice, then to your second question, could someone in another faith do this? I think, yes, in this sense that whenever what we have described is consulting the personal value system and consulting God while doing reflective practice. Now, where the difference occurs is in terms of what the consultation is, right? So, and this is where we get to the sticky place that goes back to Ken's question earlier is, okay, so if we can find common ground and we can find some common techniques, we can have communication with each other across religions and faith traditions. But we get to this very sticky place, which is fundamentally across religions, we have differences with regard to whether we believe the other faith is accessing something that is true, right? I was very blessed to be able to explore this question early in my graduate career because I was a student of Neil Johnson at The Ohio State University, an openly Presbyterian who actually then joined a non-denominational church, who was also very well known in psychology. He's a revered and respected scholar, and one of the things he said to me about common ground in practices is that when we are coming to a place from within a set of personal values, then that is our reality. And we may very well end up in these conversations with people where our reality is in the reality of truth of Jesus Christ, whereas another person is in a completely different reality, right? The reality of the teachings of Buddha or the teachings of the Tao. How do we traverse across those chasms? And the first thing to do is consider that for the other individual, the faith is the reality. And so when we start there, then we start to see that, oh, wow, yes, you actually could apply the technique that Camden and I are describing as being a fusing of reflective practice and Christian faith if you are within another tradition. So the short answer is yes, you actually could do it. Now, the trouble begins when you start to have really significant differences of opinion about whose reality is the right reality, right? And of course, our own teaching tells us that we're not going to know the answer to that question because we are also necessarily looking at things through a glass darkly. We can be tolerant and try to communicate with others in ways that honors who they are as individuals from within their value systems, while we also work to try to bring them to an understanding of ours. And I love something that George Washington Carver said when he was asked about conflicts between science and faith, between inspiration and information. And he said something to the effect, forgive me, it's not a direct quote, it's a paraphrase. He said something to the effect that the two are not ever in conflict in this sense. The more information you have, the greater will be your inspiration. Teaching at a Quaker institution, we have lots of students who come to us who don't have faith. And one of the things I will say to those students because our mission is to educate students in biblical faith, right? Also in knowledge and skills related to their disciplines. But I'll say to them, okay, we're going to look at this from the perspective of Christian faith. I realize that some of you don't have that faith. What I ask of you is that you be a seeker of truth. And I ask them to do that again and again. I talk to them about, okay, well, what are we seeking to be in our lives? Who are you seeking to be? And so often they'll say, well, I want to know what is. I want to understand. That's why I'm here at the university. I'm trying to understand reality. And I say to them, I assure you that if you seek truth, you will find it. And of course, if we look at our own scripture, it tells us that is the case. If you seek truth, you will find it. So I answered a lot of questions that were sort of also related to yours, but I think they're all intricately interconnected. So much so that your question just spawns all of the other ones, and it's an explosion of questions, which of course is probably why you had 5 questions rather than just the one, right?
Yeah, that's right. Pull it together. Camden, any further comments there?
Well, I just appreciate the question because, it does really bring up a really difficult question of, not only difference of religion on the client's end, but then difference of religion on the clinician or the practitioner or whoever may be on their end as well, and kind of moderating that. And exactly what Lauren said, you're going to have differences in perceived reality. And a lot of those are, in the model that I work through and ACT, I use it in a different clinical sense of cognitive diffusion of, okay, how do we kind of separate, what is perceived reality, what is reality? And, a lot of that having to do with anxiety, but, in this sense, approaching it from just a Christian worldview of, the faith is supposed to be transformative of, real behavior and of cognitive habit. And, it can't just stay as scripture and just needing to become something. And so, when I answer, if there is somebody else who differs in that in religion or anything like that. If there's even a clinician in that aspect, as Dr. Seifert said, it would probably depend on, different tenets or disciplines within that religion. And, that's an option, but not completely sure about that, given that this was, this paper was solidly our approach in that time that we had that case study. But something we want to see if we can expand farther out to, like as with Dr. Ken's question, to, physics, to whatever it may be.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Camden, something that you brought to my attention, I think, when we were writing the article that comes from Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen, her notion that it's not enough to know right. We need to connect that to doing right. So if we're prayerful and we're seeking God's guidance through Scripture, then engaging in reflective practice, we bring that then into the actions that we are engaging in with the client. And the way that's connected to what you noted, Camden, is that we also can help them to do that, to help them to have a sense of what the reality is and to connect their sense of belief to their actions. Now, does that mean proselytizing as a clinician? No, it means exploring the client's value system and that helps us to understand what they believe is right. It helps us to understand what they believe is right within the context of what we know about what is pathological and what is not pathological. And then to bring to fruition some connection between belief and action that moves them toward positive outcomes and out of dysfunctional behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Janelle, you want to comment on that? If not, we'll give Fred a chance and then come back to you.
I think just let some other people have a chance.
Okay, that's fine. We'll get back to you here, Janelle. But meanwhile, Fred, you have raised your hand, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I have two sons-in-law that are neuropsychologists. They got their degrees at Fuller, and I have a daughter-in-law that is taking classes in family practice psychology, you might say. The daughter-in-law asked me, you being an engineer, what do you think of having 3 in-laws that are in this field of psychology? And I said, well, you know what? It's great security because I could go crazy and 3 people would care about me. So, but anyway, my sons-in-law who are in practice now, they routinely ask leading questions about what's your faith background, and it helps them to tailor what they have to say to the people that are being neuropsychology tested and so on like that. I was wondering if the two of you could, while respecting the confidentiality of the counseling field and psychology field, if you could get to some particulars while respecting confidentiality of when it's made a difference in your counseling with patients, who, as you learned, were Christian, and B, as you learned, were of some other strong faith, say Judaism, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, where you could tailor what you had to say to the situation of those clients and how it made a difference, and if you please, how it made a successful difference, if you please.
In speaking to that, I think, an example that I could probably draw upon was when I was working in community mental health, working with individuals with severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia and things like that. One instance I can recall upon was not more so the religious difference between the client and I, It was quite literally the, how do I put it, aggressive behavior they were showing towards me. Lots of anger, lots of almost screaming kind of comparison and in my face. And, me as a person, again, having played football, I'm pretty acute to people who are yelling at me and I feel like might be a physical threat. But one thing I sat back with reflective practice on was remembering the context in which the person was doing what they were doing. I remember that this was the same. Okay, so forgive me, given that this is a very kind of field where we deal with a lot of human pain. This might be kind of graphic. I'm going to put it as light as I can. But I remember that this person, one of their actions accidentally led to the death of a child. And that is the reflective practice I had in my part, because I had my protective reaction occurring and, my fight or flight was starting to kick in. But then I, again, through reflective practice, I could calm myself in future sessions, remembering that context and remembering, Christ, and if we were going to be in that context or not. Again, scripture to call upon probably for that would be, forgive them for they know not what they do. Again, there's accountability for what the client was doing, but I am fully aware of the context and consideration that led to that behavior. Not saying that, not approving it, but accepting it in that sense. So does that help? I may have gone on a tangent. Does that help?
Yeah, I like what you said, Camden. I think the example is appropriate. I was thinking of an example from my own experience. Now, I'm not a clinician, but I've spent a lot of years working on research and consulting with especially long-term care facilities for folks who have neurodegenerative disorders. And one of the things I remind myself about is something that David I. Smith writes about in his book about the stranger. I'm trying to remember where David is, Calvin, I think. And he's actually quoting from a book by Anne Fadiman about experiences in healthcare with individuals, a family who were among the Hmong of Laos. It especially caught my interest because we had quite a bit of experience in my church when I was a child with bringing Laotian refugees. And there were some pretty significant challenges linked to the spiritualist beliefs in their culture as we were trying to help them navigate American culture, right? The reason that I remind myself about that, and in fact, I use some of those texts when I teach students, is that it speaks to that very thing, Fred, that you raised the question about. And I'm glad to hear that your family members are asking clients about their value systems and faith and exploring with them. So very often someone can come into our research setting as a participant or into our office as a client. They're dressed like we are, they speak like we do. And so we make this very risky, and we don't even realize, and easy assumption that they are like we are. As we dig a little bit deeper, we start to understand how very different we can be when we look the same. And so here's my example, which is that I was working in a long-term care facility, and this is many, many years ago, and was working with the social services folks and the activity folks at that facility to help devise some activities for the individual that would just to help with some of the more significant and growing problems with short-term memory. And the staff had developed some tasks for her. And one of them was having a camera and just taking pictures. And she would not take pictures of people. And the staff kept trying to get her to, let's take a picture of your roommate. Let's take photos and we'll put them up. Well, she had a catastrophic reaction one day. And when her sons came in, because I wasn't as able to explore this with her as a function of the fact that she was having quite a bit of trouble with her memory and reasoning and problem solving from dementia, I had a chance to explore with her sons, and they said, oh, well, this wouldn't be anywhere in her record, we don't think, but she grew up Amish. And so, of course, she grew up with, not creating any graven image. You don't draw pictures of people. You don't, the dolls didn't have faces on them, and you don't ever take a photo of a person. And but she left that community at around the age of 17 or 18. And they were puzzled that she would have had the catastrophic reaction, because they both said, well, she's not Amish now. They raised us, her parents had raised her in a Christian church, but they weren't Amish. And so as we explored, I talked to them about how, as we lose memory from Alzheimer's disease, we regress. Very often we see this, patients regress backward into the memories that are the most robust. And those are typically the longest living memories. And so this gave us an idea that perhaps she was already regressing back to a place where she might be forgetting that she was no longer Amish. So I think that's probably my best example, where really knowing the faith background was critically important.
That's a good one.
Very good. No, that's great. Thank you, Fred. That was good. Janelle, back to you. You want to share one of your other questions?
I had a question about, what your article really talks about is the challenge of integrating practice, Christian practice, in clinical settings. But I wondered about the challenge of integrating theories of practice with the faith of the clinician. Do you have struggles with the actual theories that are informing your practice and what you do in those cases?
I think for me, well, again, thank you, Janelle, for that great question. I think I can recall back to a conversation that I had with a very important person to me, and they kind of looked at me and they said, okay, do you view psychology through religion, or do you view religion through psychology? And again, that was incredibly kind of complex question to me. And so with some time to think about it, I think I've come to the place of realizing that, a lot of these theories are picking up on mechanisms that are just, God created, of realizing, attachment and theories of treatment, relations between, cognition, behavior, and emotion. And, that's why, with scripture, we have so many, verses about reducing anxiety and need to stay calm. And so, there are these directives that are in there. And really, I view a lot of these theories as the tools to go about that. And meanwhile, there are going to be some theories more, I'm not from a psychoanalytic background, more of a cognitive behavioral background, specifying an act. I have individuals who come in who, have a awful relationship with God, although it's not, the God that I know. For them, they have, a preconceived notion of who God is based on someone in their life who has, said that they believed in God and then performed a bunch of behaviors that were not Christ-like. And so in that context, I guess I'm trying to say is that, I am not too aware of like conflicting theories in that sense. I think the one that I choose in my practice, and especially with reflective practice, is choosing to reflect on the behaviors, the cognitions, and the emotions of a client in the way that Christ would want, and that we can, distinguish what is actually God in that sense, and what is the image or relationship with God that they've experienced in life that they have now created associations with. So in that sense, using those theories to clarify, who God is. Is God, say like ant, or is God actually God in that sense, and following through with, what he truly says in his scripture. So, so that's my take on that.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, Camden. That made me think of 1 Thessalonians 5, I think it's 21. Test everything, hold fast to what is good, right? I'm more worried about the theories that I don't have a knee-jerk negative reaction to. I'm more worried about the theories that I just accept. Oh yeah, this is great. I am hugging it with both arms, right? And I think over the years, what I've started to do is really think of that test everything as, like, okay, Lauren, you really have to test everything. If you hear about a theory, then prayerfully consider it. And as a great example, EMDR, right? So Cameron, I don't know if you have any experience with EMDR. My sister's a clinician in private practice, and she recently became certified in EMDR. When she was starting to talk about this some years ago, I was like, oh, come on. And that should have been the first sign that I should really prayerfully think about it and consider it. And as the years have progressed, I've looked at some of the research, and there do seem to be some applications for which it can be very useful. We're growing in terms of our understanding of it. Now, that's a research and practice technique rather than a theory, but it does rest on a set of assumptions that when I first considered them, I thought, no, this is just a whole lot of baloney. I think it really goes back to that idea of, again, testing everything and questioning everything, and prayerfully reflecting on it and considering what it might be and what it might have to bring us. And then, of course, I think of what my mom reminds me often, which is that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, so that there could be things that seem like a disaster in psychology or counseling. And yet, if we continue in robust prayer and reflection, that we can move through those to something that works for good.
Okay. All right. We've got a few hands up now. Dana, good to see you.
Good afternoon. There is a thought within education, philosophy of education. So to expand on what you've presented, to reflect on something is to look at it through our own lens and what we understand and have that reflected back. And so there's this buzzword used in education of refraction, of attempting to expand beyond what we already know. And so I think Lauren actually just talked on that, prayerfully considering. So just a comment more so, and whether you have seen that within your own practices of attempting to look beyond what we already know. And some of that goes to the seeking truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't use that particular term, but of course, physicists and those of us who do some work in sensation and perception use it in the sense that, you know, if the lens or the mirror from which the reflection happens breaks apart the light, then we begin to see the components of the light, and the overall effect is different than if it's just a veridical passing through of the light, right? So that's consistent with the notion that, one, we can break something apart and see the pieces, but two, it is also changed in terms of how it then affects us and other things by the refraction. I think that Camden does a lot of this, as we have, and Camden, you can speak on this. I think that as we have practiced reflective practice with faith integration, we have attempted to not only use the epistemic reflexivity to go back over and go back over and go back over and question what is unknown, but we have also used the faith-based reflection to think about what we do know within the context of the reflective practice, and to then suspend judgment to sort of go beyond that and inquire about what the client knows and how those things are different. So Cam, maybe you want to speak on that a little bit more.
And again, I appreciate the question because, you know, talking about, you know, things like just kind of those simple differences in general perspective is what I find very fun to draw upon when I'm in clinical practice. You know, one of kind of those mind-bending thoughts and I would say cognitive diffusion are, you know, even as we're talking about light, understanding that, you know, one point in time, everybody kind of agreed on that this was a certain color. You go to, you know, across to a different country, it's called a different color. And we're talking about, you know, sometimes quite literally the same thing, but our thought patterns can differ based on what are the words and what are the stories and the you know, culture that we're in. So I think to understanding, you know, along with the unknown comes that very direct cultural component of, you know, it doesn't have to be drastically different culture. You know, it could be anything, even domestically different between states or whatever it may be. And just, you know, as Dr. Seifert, as you said, being able to look out and kind of see that, you know, we're going over it again, but at some point we're not arriving to a conclusion, therefore we can come with judgment. You know, it's a more out of curiosity, I would say, a curiosity to, as we talk about, improve outcomes, to, you know, see what we're, you know, to project or to see what we're not seeing, or, you know, how we, you know, go about our practice and try to identify things that would assist us in even just speaking about the material with that individual. Not even has to be the specific material that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I would add to that, because I really like how you do this in practice, Camden, that part of that involves a tremendous amount of humility, which you would not admit to, but I know exists in you, that you suspend judgment in a way that allows you to also suspend that notion of, oh, I'm the expert and I know best. Let's face it, a lot of us suffer from that. I tell my students I wake up proud and a jerk every morning, and I just try to get out of the way so that something good can happen through God. And I think one of the things that has struck me about the way Camden engages in his reflective practice is that kind of hubris is just, okay, I have college degrees and I have a lot of knowledge. Let's put that aside and let me understand where this patient is. And I think for the work that Camden did with the individual we discuss in the paper, that was incredibly important. When I think about that particular person, he had limited education and worked as a tradesman for his whole career. I think for him, having had something that, having had an injury that affected his cognitive function made him feel even more vulnerable and less able to just engage in the sort of daily cognitions associated with instrumental activities of daily living and activities of daily living. And even in the example we discussed in the paper where the client had made a mistake and he dwelled on that mistake, so worried about it. But what impressed me about Camden's reflective practice, which I think is a great model, and I talk to my other interns about this these days, is that he was able to suspend that and come to the place where the client was, where the participant was. And through that, much more easily understand that fear of, I've always been stupid and I'm going to be stupid. I'm even more stupid. That kind of inner dialogue that can keep someone from making progress in rehabilitation. So, yeah, so I thought I'd add that, Kim, because I know you're not going to admit to it, but the humility is a really important part of this kind of reflective practice with faith integration.
That's very generous of you. Thank you.
All right. Very good. Yeah, we've passed the top of the hour, which is our nominal closing, but we always do continue to the bottom half of the hour as long as there are questions. So we'll keep going. We've got another one from Terry Gray. Terry?
Hi. Thank you for your paper. This question is maybe a bit peripheral to your paper. I think you illustrate very nicely how, in the context of I think you admit early in the paper that the discipline of psychology actually discourages from having a faith perspective and building the discipline on presuppositions of biblical faith, and then you also show in your paper very nicely, and thank you for that, how you in the context of that kind of secular approach discipline that is a little bit removed from a faith perspective, can practice your faith. But I just wonder if you might reflect a little more. You've said a few things here about it, but on how is it possible to practice in a discipline where some of the fundamental and foundational theories and underpinnings and frameworks are clearly at odds with a Christian faith, in terms of what's the nature of a human being, what's the relationship of that human being to God, whether God exists or not. Those all seem to be super important questions in a broader psychology perspective. And so if you're restricting yourself to sort of a discipline and presuppositions in the discipline, in your, I know that's not how you do your personal practice, in your personal reflection, you've illustrated that, but just thinking about, what it means to be a Christian in a discipline whose maybe fundamental ways of approaching the world are actually non or anti-Christian.
Yeah, Terry, I think that's a great set of questions. I have a graduate student right now, Maddie, who talks about our ability to hold things in dissonance. And one of the things I think that she and I have talked about as she's worked on her research is that for a person of faith, there has to be a level of trust in truth that allows us to hold things that appear to be in dissonance. If we come at this from Christian faith, we know that everything has been created with a perfect plan, right? And so if we find two things, and I think too, this goes back to what Kathy mentioned, and then also what I mentioned about George Washington Carver. If we find two things that appear to be in dissonance, so much so that they cannot both be true, then we must necessarily stop and reflect on those. That's what I believe. That is our place that is the place where we stop and reflect. And I think, recently being reminded of that, and especially having had that brought back home to me through the work that Maddie Blyer is doing, her research, is that we do have a lot of those things in psychology and counseling, but even more so if we look beyond that to just the everyday world, right? So psychology and counseling, we deal so intimately with everything that's wrong about the human fallenness, right? That there are so many things that just we cannot even wrap our minds around them. There was an incident with a mass killing last week, and I was sitting with my sister-in-law over the Labor Day weekend, and she said, I just don't even understand how this could happen. And I said, you and me both, and not only that, but I don't understand how millions of Jews could have been killed in the pogrom in Nazi Germany and in the surrounding nations. And she said, oh, you're blowing my mind right now. And she said, but that's what it is. It's like year after year, century upon century, there are things that don't make sense. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And those are those things that we have to hold in dissonance. And then what do we do with them? The only thing that we can do is to first prayerfully reflect, in my view. So I think that would be my answer. Cam, what do you think about that?
I'm going to hop on the historical bandwagon here. And I think one of my favorite examples from history, specifically within that same time period, is the confessional church in Germany during that time, and how there were differences theologically based on influence of German government. And confessional church was saying at that time was like, no, we're not going to support this because it's not founded by scripture. And so that's, again, kind of the disposition I'd like to take in therapy, kind of reading scripture, being in tune with scripture. And when things come across, either it be theories, either it be approaches that don't feel like they mesh, I'm, not going forthright and eliminating whatever it may be, but having just a conscious discussion, internally or with others about, kind of the morality of what's happening, or as we talked about a lot, what is reality, what is not, and what may be more biased towards a certain direction. But regardless, it's always a conversation. No quick labeling or, execution of any idea or judgment. So, and that's my little historical bit.
Yeah, I like that, Camden. And I was thinking, as you were noting that there's room for introverts and extroverts alike in this conversation, right? So I'm much more of an introvert than Camden is. So I'm going inside I'm going inside and looking, and he's going outside. But that's the beauty of being engaged in a community where we share a faith, as well as that you can go in and reflect and then come back out and have conversations and work on where the dissonance is and try to come to new understandings.
Okay. All right. Very good. We've got a few more minutes. I think we have time for one more question, and we'll turn there to Vicki Best, who, as technical host, for reasons we don't understand, is not allowed to raise her hand on the thing. I don't know about that. But at any rate, Vicki, go ahead.
Well, I checked, and you and Camden and Lauren can't either. So I figured it because we're all co-hosts. Yet I have the ability to unraise people's hands. But anyhow, thank you again. This discussion is really interesting and I think fruitful. Really appreciate how you both quoted David Myers and Walter Hearn in your article. Both are real great models of humility and grace, and have modeled that in the ASA really well. I thought your section on bedside manner was really interesting, because we've all been in situations, I'm sure, where we've been with medical professionals who have not had good bedside manner. And you think about, the reasons why someone may not have bedside manner. And I thought it was interesting that you had pointed out two things. One was oftentimes people with high expertise or highly educated can come across in arrogant ways. And your comment about reflective practice, just being aware of the awareness and reducing those attitudes and being, more empathetic can assuage the fears of the client. And then the second part, Camden, I'm sure this was you when you were talking about an instance with a client and your physical characteristics, right, of a bigger build or somebody that might be taller can also be very intimidating to someone. And just being aware of that and using the reflective practice of, reducing that perceived threat, or, improving the rapport by even, I think you used the example of just sitting down so you weren't like hovering over the person. So I think in especially therapy situations, even more so with a medical doctor, I think bedside manner is just so important in building the trust and having more effective outcomes. So my question to you, and maybe to others in the audience, is just provide your thoughts and experience on that. And then how do you apply the concept of good bedside manner across other disciplines as well?
Well, first off, again, thank you for bringing up that, kind of question, bringing up that subject. And, just even from my personal experience, I've spent a lifetime trying to let people know I'm not a threat. I was always bigger than all the other kids. And in no way am I saying I'm regretful for any disposition that I may have, as I know I can't change that or, predicted it. But, at some point I was really tall and every kid was half my height and I could accidentally trample over them. And so the whole concept was just be more careful. There are things that you receive as blessings and gifts, and there are things to be used for the benefit of others. And, but, kind of going along with that, it's double-edged sword. You have the ability to hurt other people. And that's, again, how I have perceived my physical capabilities over time, but was kind of my experience with academics as well, where there's this incredible intelligence among people that, are there. But yet it was easy to see the method of how, again, of, how would they approach you? And I have somebody in my life who I've really wanted to be like for a very long time. And they were talking to me and asking me questions all about what I had learned in school. And they were a medical doctor, but they were just so curious about me. And for me, I saw that as, okay, they obviously know all this stuff, but they're choosing that they want to be somebody with that power. They can set that down and, make me feel how I imagine people would feel around Christ when he was here. So that was, that's kind of my experience on it. But yeah.
Okay.
I sort of call that setting the table, like that intentionality before a conversation, before a meeting, before a class. How do you set the table so that everybody is sort of comfortable in that space?
Okay.
I gave you two thumbs up on that. I was thinking about the same idea of setting the table, and I find myself wondering if part of what the challenge is with academicians and practitioners who have, we've invested so much in our education. We have spent so much time and energy and very often money gaining skills and knowledge, is that, and it's so competitive, right? Academe, medicine, these are very competitive fields and types of jobs to be in, that there is way down deep inside this fear of saying something wrong or being wrong. And so if I maintain the vantage from above and I am prideful and use the voice of authority, then somehow I've fooled myself into believing that I can't be wrong. And I think that sometimes that's where the lack of bedside manner comes from, is really a deep-seated fear. But we know that if we, as persons of faith, we know that when we know nothing except through the power that comes from above. And if we do make a mistake, we can depend upon him to fix it. But also that we will make mistakes, because that is just simply the nature of it, right? So that if we can remind ourselves of that moment by moment, it makes the humility more possible and less scary. And I think Camden, you did a good job, Camden, as you were outlining that particular section about humility in the paper, sort of just thinking about what does that mean. But we gain so much, and it goes back to what Ken was noting, we gain so much if we can listen and not just insist on telling our own ideas first, but listen.
Okay. That's great. Well, I think our time is really up, and I want to thank all of you for participating here, and particularly you, Lauren and Camden. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your work, and we look forward to perhaps seeing more of your work being published later on. Okay, thank you, and farewell to everyone.